Hello, everyone. We'll be starting in just a few minutes. We'll give a chance for people to join us. Thank you all. Probably about 2 minutes and we'll be coming on. For those of you just joining, we'll be starting in about 2 minutes. We'll give a chance for everybody to come on. Let's see. All right, I think we can probably get started. A few people may be coming on a bit later, but we can go ahead and begin. Let me welcome you all. My name is Phyllis Bennis. I'm from the Institute for Policy Studies. I'm very glad to see you all this afternoon. I'm glad that we have a chance to celebrate and discuss David Barsamian's new book from City Lights Books, ReTargeting Iran. We're going to have a couple of the authors and the editor here today to talk about it. I want to thank all of them for participating. Thanks to City Lights Books. Thanks to David Barsamian, the editor of the book, and a couple of the authors who will be with us today. I'll introduce in a moment. And thanks to the IPS technical team and our events team. A few housekeeping details first. We are going until about 7 o'clock. The last half hour or so we'll be opening up for discussion and comments from all of you. You can use the Q&A in the middle at the bottom of your screen, you'll see it, for questions and comments for the panelists. If you want to add comments or put resources in the chat room for everyone to read, for all of the participants, feel free to do that in the chat. That will go to everybody. So thanks again for being with us, for joining with us today. In the midst of what has to be one of the craziest weeks that we've had in a very crazy year, the year of a global pandemic, 200,000 people, more than 200,000 people already dead of the pandemic just in this country. The president now diagnosed with COVID, being treated with a never used before combination of drugs and calling on people not to let the virus dominate their lives. The economy in collapse as a result of the pandemic. The biggest US protests in history coming together in recent months, protesting systemic racism and police violence, the worst wildfires in the history of this country, elections less than a month away, 140 million people poor and of low wealth, even before the current economic crisis. And now we're just hearing that the entire Joint Chiefs of Staff has gone into quarantine because of being exposed to the virus. And that's all the stuff that's happening just here at home. Internationally, we still have the US spreading its military bases around the world, over 800 military bases. The military budget still taking over 53 cents out of every federal dollar being sent off to the military. Threats of a new Cold War with China, the continuation of the global war on terror despite some reductions in the ground troops in the region, civilian casualties in Afghanistan alone still the highest every year, Yemen still facing the biggest humanitarian crisis in the year, Libya in chaos, the threat of a new war in the Caucasus, the number of displaced people higher than at any time in US recorded history, higher than after World War II. This is what we're looking at today. And in the midst of that, a crisis with Iran. We can say that the US and Iran have been in various kinds of crises since 1953, when the US orchestrated a coup against a democratically elected government in Iran, certainly from 1979, when the US-backed Shah was overthrown. And we've had bigger and smaller crises ever since. We had a nuclear deal that was signed, negotiated, and then abandoned. Since then, we've had continued military threats. We've had escalating sanctions. And right now, foreign policy in general is not really on top of the US public agenda. There have been changes. There have been Washington Post editorials calling for the US to boycott the Saudi-sponsored G20, given the complications of the role of what Saudi Arabia is playing in the region. The region as a whole is still in turmoil. Israel is continuing its de facto annexation of Palestinian land. Lebanon is still struggling with the consequences of the port explosion of just a couple of months ago. The Iraqi government, new government that came into power as a result of massive street protests, is now facing its own level of popular opposition and popular pressure, having to do with opposition to the role of both the United States and Iran in Iraq. All of that can be on our agenda tonight. So let me introduce our three wonderful panelists. David Barsamian first, who's the editor of the new book. David is the founder and director of Alternative Radio. That's at www.alternativeradio.org. His interviews have appeared in magazines and periodicals around the world. His latest books include Global Discontents, The Rising Threats to Democracy with Noam Chomsky, as well as Culture and Resistance, Conversations with Edward Said. Plus, I would also note one of my favorites, his wonderful book of interviews with the great Pakistani scholar Iqbal Ahmed. Trita Parsi will be up next, who's the co-founder and served as the first president of NIAC, the National Iranian American Council, who's now the co-founder and executive vice president of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Trita is the author of Treacherous Alliance, The Secret Dealings of Iran, Israel, and the United States, A Single Roll of the Dice, and Losing an Enemy, Obama, Iran, and the Triumph of Diplomacy. And Nader Hashemi, the director of the Center for Middle East Studies at the Korbel School of International Studies at the University of Denver. Nader's articles appear in the New York Times, as well as other newspapers and journals. He's the author of Islam, Secularism, and Liberal Democracy, and the co-editor of The People Reloaded, The Syria Dilemma and Sectarianization, Mapping the New Politics of the Middle East. So just as we start today, we're looking at a scenario where Trump has pulled the United States out of what was the successful Iran nuclear deal 2 years ago in 2018. The US continues to ratchet up sanctions and threats of military action against Iran. It's keeping the two countries locked in a very dangerous cycle of brinkmanship and violence. Tensions remain very high in the very crowded and over-militarized sea lanes of the Persian Gulf. The US is continuing to provoke Iran. So far, both countries have staged cyber attacks. Iran has mostly chosen not to respond in kind to Washington's military threats, but things remain very much a very dangerous scenario. David, let me start with you. The US-Iran conflict been going on for at least 40 years. The need for diplomacy and not war, also a long story. The term US-Iran crisis has been around a very long time. I wrote a book with that title back more than a decade ago. The US and Iran were both in the Iran nuclear deal, known as the JCPOA. Iran is now still in it. The US has abandoned it. The US escalates its threats and escalates its provocations with the assassination in January of this year of Iranian General Soleimani. The Iranian response was quite cautious. Then COVID hits, and foreign policy in this country is sort of off the agenda. So why are we talking about Iran now? What is the possibility of another October surprise? Why should we be refocusing on the targeting of Iran, the threats of escalation, the new military threats? What's the purpose of the book? Why is it important now? Let's start with that.
Well, you mentioned the possibility of an October surprise just before the presidential election. That is quite within the realm of possibility, and I think we have to guard against that. But you mentioned the deal, the nuclear deal, which Trita has written so eloquently about and is featured in the book. There's a very interesting thing happened a couple of weeks ago at the United Nations. It was barely reported on. It was an incredible humiliation of the United States when it sought to invoke the snapback portions of the JCPOA, of the deal, even though it had withdrawn from the deal. And in the vote at the UN, it was only able to pick up that Caribbean powerhouse, the Dominican Republic, to support its perspective. So that tells you a little bit about where diplomacy is globally. US allies are not willing to go along with the extremely punitive campaign, which is called maximum pressure, that Washington has spawned upon Iran. What's been the result of that? Have the Iranians changed their positions? Has anyone examined with scrutiny and in detail about what is actually going on? I mean, you mentioned the pandemic. Iran is very high, unfortunately, on the list of countries that have been hit hardest by the pandemic, right after the US, Russia, Bolsonaro in Brazil. India is coming up very fast, but Iran is in that echelon of countries that are suffering because of the pandemic. And I believe that evidence shows that lack of medicine and medical equipment is not getting to Iran because of the punitive sanctions. So civilians are being hurt the hardest. What happens, for example, in neighboring Iraq during the severe sanctions the US imposed in the 1990s? It drove people closer to Saddam Hussein, not away from him, because they were so dependent on the little scraps that they could get from the government. I think the same thing is happening in Iran. So I'd love to hear from Nader and Trita on that as well.
Thanks, David. Trita, let me turn to you. We're seeing a scenario right now where the tensions between the US and Iran certainly have not gone away. Conditions inside Iran from COVID, and certainly here in the United States, are horrific and may in fact get worse. Trump is sick with COVID right now. The Pentagon brass are apparently quarantining. I don't know if we can take a deep breath yet, given the tensions that still arise, but maybe we could ask you to start with this question of the Trump withdrawal from the Iran nuclear deal, from the JCPOA. Was that a strategic move, or was that Trump's showmanship to distinguish himself from Barack Obama?
First of all, thank you so much for organizing this panel. It's a great pleasure to share it with all of you, and thank you for all of you in the audience that are watching. There's very little that is done by the Trump administration that would fall under the category of strategic. This president in particular does not seem to have much of a grasp of geostrategic implications of almost anything. And in fact, even when we're talking about that, he seems to have instincts that are against getting involved in some of these wars and doesn't want to be present in the Middle East. And certainly he has made statements that seem to indicate that. And I do want to give him credit, which is, interesting enough that, we've gone 3 years without a new war in the Middle East. And it tells us something of where US foreign policy is, that when a president has not started a war in 3 years, we feel like we need to give him a medal. But when you scratch the surface and you look a little bit deeper into what he's saying, I think the idea that his instincts are not to get involved in military affairs is still competing with more profound instincts that he has. So for instance, take a look at the statement that he gave about 2 years ago, complaining about the US's presence in the Middle East, saying that this has cost us $1.7 trillion. What have we gotten for it? The sand is not worth fighting for. All of these statements that seem to indicate the instinct of not getting embroiled in all of these different conflicts around the region. But look at what he said immediately afterwards. He started saying that I know a lot of countries are looking and wondering what we will decide, whether we will stay or leave Syria. Well, and then he said, I know Saudi Arabia is following this issue very closely. And then he said, well, if they want us to stay, perhaps they should pay. This is quite an important statement, because suddenly it is not about whether involvement in Syria makes strategic sense or not. It's whether it is a lucrative endeavor or not. So the objection doesn't seem to be as to whether this is advancing stability, whether it's advancing US interests, but rather this seems to be a losing proposition, a money-losing proposition. But if the Saudis are willing to pay for America's involvement there, he doesn't seem to have an objection to it. Then it seems to be fine. So given this, I don't really think we can say that anything is particularly strategic. He had an obsession with undoing everything that Obama had done. He surrounded himself with individuals that shared his objection to the Iran deal, though it had very little to do with their antipathy towards Obama. It just so happens to be that if you're looking for people that were opposed to the Iran deal, there seems to be a significant overlap between them and the people who want to go to war with Iran. So despite his instincts and desire not to get involved in these wars, he nevertheless gave key positions to people like Mike Pompeo, later on to John Bolton and others who populated his NSC and other parts of the government, who have constantly been pushing matters in that direction. Now, in the case of Pompeo, I would say that he's probably one of the most sophisticated people in the administration when it comes to how to manipulate Trump, how to make sure that you advance your own agenda while making Trump think that you're advancing Trump's agenda. He's done it better than anyone else. He is doing what John Bolton is doing without the excessiveness and all of those different things that is associated with Bolton. He avoids some of those statements, and as a result, he does not come across as being as much in favor of a military confrontation as Bolton, whereas in reality, he's pursuing exactly the same policy as Bolton is, but with a little bit more sophistication.
Thanks for that, Trita. Let me ask you a follow-up question, and then I'll come to Nader. You know, we're seeing in the region, in the broader Middle East region, largely from the vantage point of the impact of US policy, however it is or is not strategic, there's a reshaping underway. The old dual containment approach that lasted about 20 years. You write about this in your piece in the book, where the US goal was to keep Iran and Iraq, the two key regional powerhouses, under control, to keep them from challenging the US role as a global power in the region. And of course, that dual containment theory ended with the overthrow of the Iraqi government in 2003. And since that time, and particularly, I would say in the last 3 years, under Trump, the US strategy has been focused, such as it is, on this question of building a coalition against Iran, centered by Israel, but with Saudi Arabia as the other key partner in the region, the key opponent of Iran. I'm curious what your sense is of how that shift is seen inside Iran, both at the state level, at the government level, and at the level of civil society in Iran. How do people perceive that divergence of what the US tries to do in the region?
Thank you, Phyllis. let me start off by saying that I'm not as convinced that the actual motivating factor for this is Iran. I'm not trying to say that Iran is not a motivating factor, but I don't think it is the driving factor. I think it is the most convenient pretext, because what the real common interest is between Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the UAE is not necessarily this opposition to Iran, although they all have their own problems with Iran, but rather the fear that the United States is reducing its commitment to the Middle East, leaving the region militarily, which would shift the balance of power in the region to their detriment. This is particularly problematic for Saudi Arabia and the UAE, less so for Israel because of its own actual capabilities, whereas the Saudis and the UAE are, of course, in a completely different category. Saudis more than any of them. So in order to be able to maintain, prolong the American security umbrella that has been extended to them for the last 20, 30 years, that has been so tremendously beneficial to them. I mean, the balance of power that the Saudis and the UAE currently are enjoying as a result of America's military presence, they could not in any way, shape, or form achieve on their own. Their own power does not justify it. So keeping the US locked in there is critical. And they're seeing the sentiments in the United States, the popular anger against the forever wars, even what Trump is saying on these issues, and they are fearful and they are worried that the United States is actually shifting. So getting an arrangement that allows the United States to stay in the region and continue what it's been doing for the last 2 decades is what I think is really motivating them for this. For that, Iran is a very useful instrument. Exaggerating the threat of Iran, claiming that Iran is about to establish hegemony throughout the region, that if the US leaves, chaos will take over and the Persian Empire will be reestablished, are arguments that are being used in order to make sure that the United States stays militarily in the region. And I would put the recent accord between Israel and the UAE in that category as well. We know now that, of course, that it has far less to do, if anything at all, with peace between Israel and Palestine, but much more so about an arms transfer. Why would the UAE need F-35s? What is it going to do with it? Well, you don't buy F-35s because you actually think that you're going to be needing them right away. But if you buy F-35s, you have secured America's commitment to your security. That's what it means by buying the amount and the quality of weapons that the GCC states tend to buy from the United States. None of them have a formal security arrangement with the United States. But by buying billions of dollars of weapons, they calculate quite correctly that this will bind the United States to their security. So when the Saudis go on a rampage in Yemen and start bombing that country, well, who is there supporting them, providing them with refueling, providing them with replenishment of ammunition, et cetera, et cetera? The United States is. So in order to be able to continue to keep the US there, which I think is the real issue, Iran, arms sales, et cetera, is going to be quite valuable. But if you take a look at UAE's own foreign policy, if it truly is such that it is so concerned about Iran, one would wonder, why is it then expending so much of its political and military capital in Libya, fighting the Turks, or elsewhere in the region, in which its main opposition actually seems to be Erdogan, the Muslim Brotherhood, and Qatar, not Iran? So this is a frame that I think is very effective to use in Washington to convince people to continue what we've always been doing for the last 30 years. I think it has less reality on the ground. Again, I want to emphasize, this does not mean that there isn't a real perception of threat from Iran or that there aren't real problems. But my argument is that is widely exaggerated in order to justify something completely different, which is the US's continued military domination of the region.
And certainly the continuation and escalation of these arms sales is very much a key component, whether it's,
yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Nader, let me turn to you. We've been talking just now mostly about the state actions, and you've written significantly about civil society in Iran in your piece in the book as well. You write about the flowering of civil society at various points in post-revolutionary Iran in various movements for democracy that have happened. You wrote about the class differences between the 2009 and 2019 protest movements and how those two both are distinct and what might occur if they were to come together. I'm curious how you see it now, in the wake of COVID's attack on civil society in Iran, in the context of U.S. sanctions that have been so devastating already. Where is civil society where it's facing COVID? How are those class differences emerging, and how do you think civil society's impact on the Iranian state, the Iranian government, may take shape in a different way as a result of COVID and its responses?
Oh, great question. First of all, great to be with everyone. A huge honor to be, in this book with David Barsamian, who's a very long and dear friend. The situation in Iran today with respect to civil society is probably the darkest moment in post-revolutionary Iran's history. You can't have a civil society unless you have somewhat of a civil state that's willing to recognize autonomy for civil society to organize and to exist. You have a repressive state in Iran that has become increasingly repressive with every passing year, and you have multiple crises. So the COVID crisis is just the latest blow to Iranian society that has devastated, large numbers of people. The official, figures with respect to COVID in Iran are 27,000 dead, about 500,000 cases. No one takes those figures at face value. The numbers are much higher, and the regime is trying to hide it. But of course, the people who are paying the big price with respect to all of these crises, not just the COVID crisis, but the US imposed sanctions, are not members of the ruling elite, not the Revolutionary Guard Corps, not the political establishment in Iran, but the average citizen. It's important to point out that there was this, there was this brief moment of optimism in Iran in 2015. This has been, what I'm about to say has been completely, I think, ignored in the commentary, in the debate on the Iranian nuclear agreement, the JCPOA. Iranian civil society, Iran's pro-democracy movement, Iran's human rights movement, overwhelmingly supported the Iran nuclear agreement, largely because they saw it as a way out of an existing dilemma where society was suffering under sanctions, where there was a repressive state that did not want to engage with the international community. People celebrated when the agreement took place. Every significant human rights and pro-democracy figure in Iran officially endorsed the agreement, largely because they saw that there would be perhaps a path forward where civil society could start to reconstitute itself, where they could start to organize and make demands from the state, where the economy would improve, where the middle class that had been severely punished under previous sanctions would be able to, would be able to thrive again. And so there was this door that was opened. It was a door that didn't guarantee sort of an immediate democratic transition, but I think it held the prospects for better internal social conditions and, critically, better international conditions. I mean, we often forget that when we talk about right conditions for democracy, for democratization, we often focus on the internal nationalist perspective. But in the case of the Middle East, in the case of Iran in particular, you cannot ignore the regional and international environment that imposes a set of conditions that often inhibit democratization. And in the case of Iran, with the constant threat of war, with the potential of a military attack, that effectively meant that the state could sort of invoke the national security, play the national security card, use the threat of an external attack to suffocate civil society. So with the JCPOA, there was a lot of optimism that perhaps things would get better. And of course, that all came to a crashing end when Donald Trump got elected and he pulled out of the agreement and imposed these, crippling sanctions on Iran that I want to emphasize again, has really devastated the average citizen, has devastated civil society. I mean, there is no civil society if you want to be, accurate and honest about it. It's facing fundamental. I mean, the biggest adversary that civil society in Iran is facing is the regime itself, which is brutal, which has become increasingly brutal. I mean, now you have a situation where you post something on social media, you can get arrested. So it's a dark moment, and it's a dark moment because of a constellation and convergence of factors, not just regime oppression and suppression, but also, devastating economic sanctions, a COVID crisis on top of all of that, and, very little hope or clarity over what might come next. Let's say in the best case scenario, Joe Biden gets elected and the United States signs back onto the nuclear agreement, and the economy starts to get better. It's going to take a very long time for civil society to reconstitute itself to be able to, take advantage of any political openings, because it's been so brutalized and suppressed by some of the factors that I've just listed.
Let me follow up on that for a moment. Iran has a history of collaborating with the U.S. at various points, most notably perhaps to the detriment of Afghanistan, I would say, in the post-invasion period in late 2001, when Iran was a partner of the U.S. essentially in creating this artificial government that was planted in Kabul after the overthrow of the Taliban-led government there. And the relationships were, from reports on both sides, was quite a collaborative one. It ended rather suddenly when Bush went ahead with his Axis of Evil speech, essentially promising regime change against Iran at that time. I'm curious what you think now is the potential, if there is a Biden victory, for instance, and if Biden were to reclaim the Obama credential, which he's trying to do in his campaign certainly, of having orchestrated the Iran nuclear deal, and he returns to support that and goes back to a version of it. What is the potential that you see for going beyond the nuclear deal to what used to be called a grand bargain with Iran, something that was talked about but never was quite close enough, that would involve more than just the nuclear arrangements, but would involve serious negotiations about normalization of relations between the two countries? Do you think that's a possibility in a future post-Trump government in this country? Would it be that different?
That's a good question. Let me just say on the question of normalization of relations, that's not going to happen largely because of domestic Iranian politics. The nature of the regime is such that it cannot have normalized relations with the United States because it undermines the unity that ties hardliners together. So that's not going to happen as long as the current structure of power in Iran is in place. But there could be something along the lines of what you suggested in terms of a grand bargain. I think that theoretically is there, and I think it's largely dependent on to what extent the advisors that Joe Biden is going to rely on are interested in pursuing those conversations. It just so happened that yesterday I caught an interview between Christian Amanpour and CNN and Elliot Abrams. And Elliot Abrams, of course, has been brought into the administration. He's basically the Trump administration's point of contact with respect to Iran policy. And if you listen to what he was saying, and I think he was very much sort of saying things with the intention of trying to convince the Biden administration about future Iran policy. And he was making an argument that unfortunately I think is going to sound somewhat convincing to many people in the US foreign policy establishment that leans towards Joe Biden. He was arguing that, look, these sanctions over the last several years have hurt Iran. Iran is significantly weakened. Let's not relent at this moment. We can get a much better bargain. We can bring Iran to its knees. Now is not the time to sort of sign back onto the JCPOA. We are in a good bargaining position. So there's no reason for us to sort of think about, diplomacy or compromise with Iran. Let's try and use our strengthened position as a result of Trump sanctions to get a better deal, to get greater concessions from Iran. To the extent that argument has weight in Joe Biden's foreign policy team, it suggests that there's not going to be any appetite or interest in a grand bargain in trying to resolve some of these broader regional issues. It suggests that it's going to be a lot of very tough negotiations and strong reluctance on the part of the Biden administration to go anything beyond a discussion of the terms of the JCPOA. So I don't see it happening. That's my reading, but of course, Trita knows the Washington scene much better than I do, and I'd be interested in hearing what he has to say on the topic.
Well, let me turn to you, Trita, on a related question. We know that there are political forces throughout Washington in the arms manufacturing lobby and the pro-Israel lobby and in other components, the Saudi and UAE lobbies, that are pushing hard consistently for a military response to Iran, for escalating the tensions with Iran. But you also wrote, including in your piece in the book, in ReTargeting Iran, you wrote about the role of mass mobilization in the United States as a way of neutralizing the influence of those lobbies. Could you talk a little bit about that and how the mass mobilization, anti-war mobilization emerges, and how that comes up against these lobby pressures from the arms manufacturers and others, and how that could play out in this situation?
Sure. I think if we actually take a look at some of the big instances in the last 10 or 15 years, to me, it's become quite clear that these special interests, whether it's the arms manufacturers or those that are very close or sympathetic to the Likud party, etc., they do have a tremendous amount of influence, but their influence really is only decisive when the American public is absent. When the American public is actually mobilized and present, you have a rather different scenario, whether it is over the JCPOA, where a big coalition of civil society groups showed a tremendous amount of support for the efforts of the Obama administration and managed to win a tremendous amount of votes in Congress, and really outflooded the other side in many different ways. But also if you take a look at the proposed move to authorize war with Syria, in which over a short period of time, there was a window for the public to make its voice heard, and they did. And the phone calls in favor, or actually the phone calls against going into Syria, according to lawmakers we spoke to, were roughly 9-1. And that's a scenario in which you had AIPAC lobbying in favor of it. You had the defense industry lobbying in favor of it. You had the administration lobbying in favor of it. But when the public was mobilized, and in this case, they were strongly opposed to that idea, it was overwhelming. The difficulty and challenge, of course, is that the public is too distracted on the normal circumstances by the Kardashians and whatever else is happening in the country. They're not paying attention to these things. And they only tend to pay attention when we're just a couple of seconds before midnight, when there is a crisis about to happen, and that's when they mobilize. If measures can be taken to make sure that at a minimum, their participation level is on the normal circumstances higher, not at the crisis level, I think the landscape could look quite different in Washington when it comes to these different issues. And we would not be in a scenario in which under normal circumstances, these various lobbies are essentially driving the bus, but when it is about to crash, the public comes in and tries to steer the wheel in a better direction. It would be much better if it was a rather different proportions on this. I think it's absolutely achievable, but it's going to be extremely difficult, mindful of the very, very long list of potential distractions and other issues that they will be concerned about. One way, however, in which this will increasingly, not just necessarily in the case of Iran, but much more so in the case of China, where we will have the potential of seeing a much higher level of public engagement at an earlier stage, is because of how the potential Cold War with China will affect another issue that more and more Americans are heavily concerned about in a much more intense and prolonged manner, and that is climate change. So under those circumstances, you can see a very different scenario.
Phyllis, could I interject a comment?
Sure, of course.
Your question resonated in my mind in the context of US policy toward Yemen and Saudi Arabia. What we've seen in this country over the last 2 years is something that I never thought I'd see in my lifetime, where you had a mobilized public putting pressure on elected representatives in Congress to shift U.S. policy with respect to the war in Yemen. Just to give you a story, when 2 years ago in the fall of 2018, when we organized our first event on Yemen, we had standing room only audience from people I'd never seen before, really outraged and angered over images and reports of what was being done to the civilian population in Yemen as a result of US arms sales to Saudi Arabia. There has been a mobilization and a campaign by American citizens largely that I think has, has produced things that are, something to be celebrated. You had two resolutions in the American Congress, both at the House level and the Senate level, calling for the ban of future arms sales, ongoing arms sales to Saudi Arabia. It was vetoed by the president. But that mobilization and that vote in Congress, I think, was largely, not largely, but was significantly a result of public pressure responding to courageous journalism in the mainstream press, reporting on what was being done to Yemeni civilians by American-made weapons. That type of, what we've been seeing, in other words, in the context of, U.S. policy in Yemen, has been driven in part by, public outrage over U.S. policy towards Saudi Arabia. It has to do with the aftermath of the Khashoggi murder, but largely, I think American citizens just outraged and angered that their country is supporting a war in Yemen that is creating a famine, killing children, and committing war crimes. And this has been sort of part of the public conversation over the last 2 years. And it does provide, I think, a source of optimism in the sense that an organized, citizenry can pressure, politicians to try and shift U.S. policy. It hasn't produced the results that I think all of us want, but it might produce results in the context of a Joe Biden administration, who I think will have to try and distance himself from what Trump has been doing with Saudi Arabia, and particularly in the context of Yemen.
I think it's a very important model that you speak of, Nader, about the Yemen model, because it does point to this exact question of how movements build on each other. I was thinking about the great film that Amir Amirani did called We Are Many, that's primarily about the global mobilization against the Iraq War that happened on February 15th, 2003. But it also goes beyond that, including the question of the mobilization against U.S. bombing of British and U.S. bombing of Syria. It includes other protests as well, the Occupy movement, the Arab Spring, the overthrow of Mubarak in Cairo. And one of the lessons, I think, that Amir draws out in that film is exactly what you're talking about here, that you have the potential for massive pressure that can, under some circumstances, have an incredible impact, even when it doesn't necessarily win the victory that you want at the moment you're fighting for it. So the protests, despite it being the largest global mobilization in history at that time, 14 million people in the streets on the same day with the same demand, the world says no to war, and yet the war went ahead. But it's also true that 10 years later, the people in Cairo who had been the leaders of the February 15th movement were among the much broader leadership of the Arab Spring in Cairo that led to the overthrow of Mubarak. That happened in a number of other regions. So you can't always anticipate what will emerge even from a protest, a mobilization that doesn't achieve its initial goal, but looking forward has that kind of potential. I wanted to come back. I think it's such an important component looking at this combined role of the states, the governments, and civil society. Something that you mentioned earlier, Trita, about climate change. And this is something that you touch on in your piece in the book, that Iran's National Security Agency recognized climate change as the second most important threat that it faced in the world, which I don't think our national security agencies are quite at that stage yet, although they're getting closer. But I'm curious what you think about the role of civil society, both in the US and Iran, in changing some of those policies that are looking at the question of the impact of climate change in Iran, the impact of climate refugees, both to and from Iran potentially, any of that. How does that play out right now in terms of how this issue that is mobilizing more people around the world right now than any other, climate change, how is that playing out in the relationship between Washington and Tehran?
I think it's an extremely important question. Unfortunately, it has a rather sad answer to it. The citation I made there is actually from a period prior to the JCPOA, in which the Iranian National Security Advisor identified it as the #1 threat, sectarianism, because of the manner in which it could rip the country apart internally. Secondly, climate change. Thirdly, was the United States. Things have gotten much worse since then, both on the climate dimension, but also in the manner in which the deep state in Iran has started to criminalize involvement in environmental work. We've seen the case of several environmentalists who have been in prison. Some of them have been killed in prison. And what 15, 20 years ago was seen as the rather safe space when it came to Iranian NGO engagement. You know, if you were in an NGO and you were working on women's issues, you were a bit on the front line, you were taking risks, you were pushing the envelope. Environment was seen as a very, very safe area. That is unfortunately not the case any longer. So unfortunately, you have a scenario in which both countries right now are doing far too little and are not allowing the societies to move in the right direction on this issue. And that is highly problematic. It is particularly problematic for the Iranians, mindful of the fact that Iran is going to be one of the countries that will be hit the earliest and the hardest from climate change. We've already seen that. So much of where Iran's food is being grown internally is already being affected by this. So Iran is going to face massive crisis in this area going forward. And again, here is another area where sanctions and the denial of technology is going to be an unfortunate factor in how things evolve.
Remember, the great river in Isfahan is now completely dry as a result of extremely high temperatures, record-breaking temperatures and drought, which the country has been suffering from.
That is true, but there's also a lot of mismanagement, a tremendous amount of dams and other things that have been built without proper environmental impact assessments of it. So unfortunately, the state has actually made matters worse, not just neglected them, but actually made matters worse. There seems to be an awareness of it, but unfortunately, under these circumstances, with the very tense relationship with the United States, the sanctions, etc., it creates very little space for movement on those areas.
I'm curious what any of you think about the potential for the climate crisis to help ease or at least support the climate activists in all the countries in the region, potentially ease some of the tensions between the governments in the region who face this enormous challenge of climate change and have to be recognizing that they cannot deal with it with borders, that the climate crisis doesn't recognize borders. And as long as they continue to refuse to deal with each other, they're not going to be able to deal with shared waterways. I mean, we know the history of that in the Shatt al-Arab and other parts of the region where the crisis was less about oil than it was about water, and that's only going to continue. Is that likely to change the dynamics at all?
No. No.
Go ahead, Nader.
A quick comment. The fundamental security challenge that many governments, at least in the Middle East, including Iran, face, and that is at the top of the priority list in terms of ruling regimes, is not the question of climate change and environmental degradation. It's regime survival. That's where all the energy, the investment, the focus of national attention is, and that applies also to the question of Iran. The question of climate change and dealing with environmental degradation implies an ability to think long-term, to put in place policies and plans that will reap benefits down the road. Authoritarian regimes are fundamentally motivated by very short-term calculations. In the case of Iran, the regime suffers from a crisis of legitimacy, a restless population that aspires for political change, and it's facing immense pressure from abroad. In the case of the United States, an attempt to bring the regime to its knees and to collapse the economy, as is happening as we speak. The question of planning and organizing and meeting with other countries to deal with climate change is just nowhere on the horizon in terms of the list of priorities. That's how authoritarian regimes think, and that's not just the case of Iran, this is, I think, broadly speaking among authoritarian regimes everywhere. They're interested in regime survival, not in how they can change the environment or the climate so that all of their citizens can prosper down the road.
Could I chime in there as well,
Sure.
if that's okay? Because I largely agree with Nader on this issue. And to add to his point, I mean, just take a look at how the reaction to COVID has been. Rather than seeing it as a common threat that necessitates collaboration, several of the states viewed it rather to see how can this be used to advance their already confrontational objectives. The United States, for instance, saw COVID as an amplifier of maximum pressure. We saw some collaboration between UAE and Iran, but it doesn't seem to have really reached the level that it should, of course. But I would differ a little bit in now there's differentiation between democracies and authoritarian states. I do agree with him that authoritarian states do tend to be much more focused on their own survival, but I don't think we should give democratic states a pass here. It's not as if the democratic states necessarily are doing as well as they should be in this realm. I mean, climate change is being neglected, unfortunately, by everyone. Some are doing worse than others. But thinking that fixing it with democracy, I fear is unfortunately not enough.
I want to follow up with both of you on this for a moment, but first I just want to remind our listeners and watchers, in a few minutes we're going to open up for comments and questions from the audience. Please use the Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen to enter your questions or comments. We may not be able to get to all of them, but we'll get to as many as we can, starting in the next few minutes. But just coming back to this question of climate, I'm a bit curious how you all see the question of climate refugees in the region. Iran historically has been a country of refuge for particularly refugees from Afghanistan, but from elsewhere as well, has for many years been a country which hosted large numbers of refugees. The possibility remains, I suppose, of both internally displaced people in Iran and significant numbers of Iranians at some point being forced out of the country to look for work, who become climate refugees themselves. This may be the sort of thing that forces governments, whatever their preferential approach, to treat the issue of climate in a very different way and in a far more serious way than they have in the past, no?
Good question. No, I think you're absolutely right. The problem of global climate change does have devastating effects precisely in the ways that you sort of outlined, Phyllis. People no longer can make a living in traditional ways, particularly in farming and in agriculture, because the conditions are just not there. They have to move to different areas. They have to try and flee the country if they can. So there are these sort of second and third order effects that result from climate change in many developing countries around the world, that produce destabilization, that produce migration, that produce refugee crises. There's a lot of good scholarship on the question of Syria, that the origins of the uprisings and the destabilization take place as a result of climate change issues in some of the rural areas in Syria that produce discontent, unemployment, anger at the central government, that created social conditions for an uprising. This also applies in the case of Iran. There's a lot of smaller demonstrations that take place among farmers and workers routinely, in many ways responding to these climate change issues. In the case of Iran, climate change hasn't produced massive waves of refugees, but they have produced sort of economic conditions that have made unemployment much more difficult, have added to, societal discontent, have, in many ways, the protests that we've seen in recent years in Iran, primarily by young people in smaller towns and villages, protesting their, economic condition, are indirectly related to, the overall economic conditions in the country that are exacerbated by climate change issues. So I think this is an issue that's not going to go away. It's only going to get worse, and it's going to make governing the society is much more difficult. It is an indirect, I think, contributor to why people choose to migrate and leave when they can no longer make a living as their parents or as their extended family are used to making a living, particularly in smaller towns and rural areas.
There's an aspect of that Trita, you touched on in your piece when you compared the level of scientific unanimity on the value of the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, with the scientific unanimity on climate change. And I'm curious how that reality might play out in both. There was another reference I was curious about that you mentioned directly, and I think, Nader, you spoke of it in a more general sense, that there was a reference to two of the people who were participating in the negotiations over the JCPOA, one on the Iranian side, one on the US side, both of whom had been nuclear science majors at MIT at the same time. And we know that there have been huge numbers of Iranians who have gone to school in the US going back decades. Is that connection, both around those who have studied climate, those who have studied nuclear science, those who have studied petroleum science, all the Iranian students I used to work with back in the anti-Shah days all seemed to be engineers of one sort or another. I don't think there was a sociologist among them. But I'm curious if you think that existing connection it's now older generations, it certainly isn't any longer available for younger Iranians, particularly right now with Trump's Muslim ban in effect. But I'm wondering if you think that unanimity around climate that scientists around the world share is the kind of potential that could lead to new approaches, new breakthroughs in some combination of civil society and governmental decision making.
If one were to be quite optimistic, yes, it would be quite excellent if that was the case. I remain skeptical, however. Even if that unanimity were to exist, it is not sufficient to be able to overturn the pathologies that already exist of the security states and how they deal with each other. It could become, at best, I believe, a factor that would help facilitate an already existing shift in those security centers of the two countries, rather than being the driving force of it. That doesn't mean that it's not a positive thing. It doesn't mean that we should invest in it, but I'm skeptical about solutions in which too much emphasis is put on that as a way of steering the security establishment rather than focusing directly on the security establishments.
Yeah, just a brief interjection. I mean, if you're interested in this story in the context of Iran, look up the story in the case of the young man by the name of Kaveh Madani. He was a very prominent environmental sort of expert in environmental politics, particularly in questions of water, resource sort of management. And he was brought back to Iran from England by the Rouhani administration and given a very prestigious position to deal with Iran's climate change problems. Long story short, because he was, politically independent and because he was very good at what he was doing, he was basically harassed and put under surveillance by the, Iranian hardline establishment, by the security forces. And he was forced to effectively flee the country, not for doing anything wrong, but simply because he was an effective environmental expert in his field. And he was independent-minded, and he was working with the Rouhani administration. And by all reports that we were getting, doing very good work. But because the reigning security establishment in Iran, particularly the hardline, establishment, just didn't like him and didn't like the fact that Rouhani brought this expert from England, and were very fearful of this being a trend. So the expertise exists. There's a lot of talented Iranians who know a lot about environmental politics. But as long as the structure of power in Iran remains as it is, with deep factional rivalry and a deep sort of set of political interests, where hardliners do not want to bring back competent, knowledgeable people who can deal with some of these issues, you're not going to get any progress. I mean, so you could have the best minds. You're absolutely right, Phyllis. There's a lot of bright, talented Iranians around the world, but they're not going to be able to come back and work in Iran and make a contribution to, political or economic development as long as the current a structure of power remains in place, and as long as the current ruling elites are in place. You're going to have exactly the same thing that happened to Kaveh Madani. He just happens to be actually speaking at UCLA this week, and that's why his name was on my mind. I think it's a perfect demonstration and illustration of the problem of authoritarian politics, not just in Iran, but this is a similar story that you can apply to many other countries in the region, preventing talented people from coming back and making a contribution to their home countries.
Let's move over to some of the questions that have come from our audience today. There's a bunch of questions coming in. I'm going to jump around among them. This is from one of the questioners asking what you all think about the fact that Iran is being forced by US maximum pressure to get closer to China. What would be the effect of alignment of Iran's foreign policy becoming closer to the East and to Asia than to the West? What effect would the panelists see on civil society under this situation? Interesting question.
Can I start, Nader?
That's Trita. Please go ahead.
So I think, first of all, we have to look at this issue of Iran's so-called realignment with China. It seems to me to be rather exaggerated at this point. I think it's primarily exaggerated by the Iranians because they want to signal that they have another option. Not so much if the US rejects them, but if the Europeans don't do anything to be more helpful in practical terms when it comes to saving the JCPOA. The agreement that is currently being negotiated or considered, we don't know the full details of. There's some drafts circulating around, but it does not seem to be particularly different from agreements that the Chinese already have signed with the Saudis, for instance. The Chinese approach to the Middle East is not to take Iran's side in the internal rivalries of the Middle East. The Chinese position is to stay out of those to the extent that they can, benefit from trade, explore new markets, but unlike the United States, that seems to have an instinct of getting itself involved in everyone else's business and thinking that it is the solution to other countries' problems, the Chinese have almost the exact opposite approach. They just want to stay out of these. And the idea that they would now suddenly get themselves involved on Iran's side vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia, I find highly unconvincing. Will they support Iran vis-a-vis the United States? Yes, to a certain extent, but only as long as it doesn't complicate their own relationship with the United States further. And right now, of course, that relationship is in a very bad state. But if it were to actually progress beyond what we have seen, it will further move the Middle East towards some form of not so much multipolarity, but rather some form of bipolarity, which in and of itself is going to be a messy process to begin with. I mean, just take a look at Turkey's position vis-a-vis Iran and other issues. We discussed a little bit of Nagorno-Karabakh. I mean, we are not talking about clean alignments in the region right now. So it will be a factor. Another thing that can happen in all of this is that if the Chinese interest in the region grows significantly, whether it's because the Iranians are pushing them in or whatever, the Persian Gulf, rather than just being an area of security competition between Iran and Saudi and an American angle here, can also become an arena of Chinese and Indian security collaboration down the road. So there's a significant amount of risk and too many variables to be able to make any easy predictions about this. The only thing I think we can say with some degree of certainty is that this is still not in any way, shape, or form as advanced as some of the news reporting and the talking points give the impression that it is.
I think you're right that the focus has been very much on whether this is part of a new Chinese challenge to the United States in terms of its role in the region, which it clearly is not. It's a very different kind of engagement in the region. I am curious, though, coming off of that question, what you just pointed to, Trita, and either one of you may have an idea on this, on the question of the relationship between Iran and Turkey, which right now is becoming more and more complex. Either of you want to jump in on that one?
I would very much like to hear what Trita has to say on this, because I don't think I have any profound thoughts, and I would value his comments.
Thank you, Nader. I will not claim to have any profound thoughts on this either, but I will say, though, that we are looking at what I think we could be expecting, that once the era of Pax Americana is over, we're going to be entering an era of great confusion and a messy process of trying to find alignments. In Syria, the Iranians and the Turks are clearly on the opposite side, but because of the depth of their relationship and the tradition of their relationship that stretches back centuries, and the maturity of these two states, however problematic both of them are, there's been a rather successful way of being able to compartmentalize the areas where they compete and the areas where they collaborate. Few other relations in the Middle East can claim to have that degree of maturity and compartmentalization. But then in Nagorno-Karabakh right now, they seem to be clearly on the opposite side as well. But in the issue of Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE forming an alliance, then they're much closer to each other. Both of them are fearing what this could mean for the region. The Turks have a deep animosity and a competition with the UAE, and tensions between Israel and Turkey have been growing quite some time. Then you have a Greek dimension of it coming in. We're entering an area in which a lot of unresolved conflicts are coming up to the surface now. And I suspect that it's going to continue to be very, very complex, very messy, and it's going to take quite some time before you see any type of clean alignments here.
One of the other questions reflected a similar question. What are the Iranian objectives behind its involvement in Yemen? We've touched on that briefly, but I think it is a complex one, again, that's being described in the US press as being primarily to back up the Houthi rebels against Saudi Arabia, and it's putting Yemen into this category of being a proxy war between Iran and the Saudis, as if the internal contradictions that have existed within Yemen for so long had no role to play here. But how do you both see that that objective for Iran?
Sorry, yeah, very quickly. I think Iran's role in Yemen is basically just to stick it to the Saudis and make their life difficult, and they've largely been successful. Iran's role in Yemen, most independent observers realize, is grossly exaggerated in terms of the discourse and the attention that it gets in terms of the U.S. foreign policy position. Iran's investment in Yemen is actually quite minimal compared to what the Saudis are investing on a monthly basis, and they've been able to, bleed the Saudis sort of dry. And they've been largely successful at doing that. It's basically a quagmire for the Saudis, and it's just been a way of, I think, advancing Iranian interests with respect to Saudi Arabia by sticking it to them where the Saudis are very sensitive, effectively in their backyard. And so I don't think it's anything more than that. I don't think there is. If you listen to some of these ridiculous comments that you hear by people in the mainstream who claim to be, wise commentators on foreign policy. I'm thinking of Thomas Friedman, when he famously commented on the war in Yemen. He said it's fundamentally about Sunnis versus Shia and who will succeed the Prophet Muhammad. That's the core of the conflict. So I think that has nothing to do with what's going on in Yemen. I think the Iranians have exploited an opportunity to provide support to the Houthis as a way of putting pressure on the Saudis, and the Saudis basically fell into the trap, and they're paying, I think, a big price for it.
An even greater sin, I would say, of Tom Friedman's description here is that he described the Houthis at one point as pro-Iran, which essentially would mean that these Houthis are doing what they're doing because of their allegiance to Iran, which is just absolutely nonsensical. This is a long-standing Yemeni conflict that has existed there for quite some time. Unfortunately, both the Iranians and the Saudis have used it for their own purposes, and it shows again the significant danger that exists for a state to become weak under these circumstances. If a state becomes weak under these circumstances, it will become, its territory, it runs the risk of becoming the arena of the security competition of the other bigger states. And in the region right now, that is primarily UAE, Iran, Israel, Turkey, and the United States itself, of course. In that sense, both the Iranians and the Saudis have aggravated the situation in Yemen tremendously and prolonged that war and the suffering of the people of Yemen. And again, this is part of the reason I'm somewhat skeptical that issues such as environment will be some sort of magical car that will resolve these issues. There are profound security challenges in the region that need to be addressed for what they are.
That's certainly true, although I think more and more people are coming to see climate change as a security issue when you look at the question of its consequences. But let me move on to another question that we started to touch on here really, which goes to the question of how we build movements in the United States. One of the other countries in the region facing that same challenge as Yemen, where it's being used by outside powers in all kinds of ways, is of course Syria. And a question has come in, how do we fight back against US escalation towards Iran in ways that don't ignore or even openly whitewash the Iranian regime's war crimes against the people of Syria in the context of a Syrian war in which all of the outside powers, the United States, Russia, Saudi, are all responsible, as is Iran, for war crimes of all kinds against Syrians. So it's always a challenge in the United States. You both have touched on that in your pieces in the book about what it means to oppose the US escalation towards Iran while not being uncritical of Iran's own role, both domestically and in the region. You want to speak to that?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's an excellent question. I just want to state at the outset that while a lot of participants in the war in Syria have committed war crimes, overwhelmingly and comprehensively, if you look at the human rights record, it's the Assad regime and its Iranian and Russian allies that are responsible for the vast majority of those war crimes and crimes against humanity. That's not to say that other parties are not guilty, but it's not a level playing field. In terms of, how do you respond to both, how do you respond to multiple sort of moral causes happening at the same time? I think you have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. In other words, you have to be able to both be concerned about what's happening in Iran and happening in Syria at the same time. You also have to be cognizant of the fact that I think, we're living in the United States, and the United States has a particular role that it's playing, more so in some countries and not so in others. So I think we have to ask ourselves, what can we actually do to affect change? To what extent can we make a difference in some of these conflicts? And I think to the extent that the United States is a participant and is contributing to human suffering, that places a greater moral burden on American citizens to take responsibility for the policies of their own government and what's being done with their tax dollars. So I think that's something that has always guided me when it comes to thinking about these issues. The other thing that guides me in terms of sort of a rule of thumb is be a little bit humble and be a little bit sort of circumspect before offering grandiose plans and policies for solving some of these issues. My rule of thumb is, before you get involved and want to help any particular cause or group of people that are suffering, listen to what those people are telling us. Listen to organically connected grassroots leaders with democratic credentials, and listen to what they have to say about their own situation and what they want from the international community and what they want from the United States. These formulaic sort of responses that you sometimes see from many of our friends and comrades on the left sometimes can be very detrimental in terms of advocating solutions and policies that really don't help solve conflict, they actually advance it. So that's my rule of thumb. I listen very closely to, of course, Iranian civil society activists, human rights activists. I also do the same in the context of Syria. I think those are sort of broad rules that I try and subscribe to when it comes to dealing with these issues.
Thanks for that. I would just add my own view. I had written quite a bit on Syria, that what I think from the United States, from our position, should have been and remains a call for ending the war rather than for supporting either side. By the time the serious fighting had begun, there was no, as far as I'm concerned, there was no side I wanted to support among the armed actors. The unarmed civil society actors who were not the ones involved in the fighting was a different matter. But it's also just to note, we should be very clear that it's always very complicated when people on the ground call for very different things. People in Libya called for US intervention. Others said explicitly, do not come, we don't need you. The same has been true in Syria, it's true in a number of places. So it's always a big challenge. We have time for a couple more
Could
questions.
I chime in? Can I
Yeah,
chime
of
in
course,
quickly
Jude,
on this one as well?
Of course.
I agree with a lot of what has been said, and I think a good rule of thumb as well is to not look at these conflicts as if there's good guys and bad guys. Usually there's only bad guys when it comes to these things, instead of romanticizing these struggles and thinking that the United States needs to do X, Y, and Z militarily to involve. All of them have a tremendous amount of blood on their hands. I think it is worth noting, though, that the United States, Jim Jeffries, who's responsible for Syria policy in the Trump administration, has very explicitly said that our effort there right now is to make Syria a quagmire for the Russians, which means we are actively prolonging the war. And I think it is noteworthy that when the Trump administration came in, they abandoned the Geneva process that existed for trying to find a political solution to that conflict. No one is saying that would have worked. No one is saying that is promising, but we completely abandoned it. And so did the Europeans afterwards. And that process essentially morphed into the Astana process that is headed by Assad, Russia, Iran, and Turkey. So we're not even talking about a pretense of pursuing diplomacy. We completely abandoned it. I think it's also noteworthy that when that happened, it made no headlines whatsoever. But when Jim Mattis resigned because he didn't want to move 2,000 troops out of Syria, or when Trump didn't want to move 2,000 troops out of Syria, you saw several senior people resigning. No one resigned, no one threw a tantrum on TV when the United States completely abandoned diplomacy. So if there's anything we can do from this end over here, echoing what Phyllis said, is to actually put pressure for a support of a diplomatic process that brings some political capital to try to bring that conflict to an end, rather than thinking that this is some sort of a Manichaean fight of good and evil and that we need to take sides. Because when we take sides, we become belligerents and we become part of the problem.
Certainly on the military side, that's true. Let's come back to Iran. We have time for maybe two more questions. One has to do with the impact of sanctions, the US sanctions that have recently been escalating in Iran, on Iran's policies related to environmental issues such as water shortages. I think part of what that must refer to is the question of how US sanctions are impacting the Iranian ability to access equipment and repair facilities, et cetera, for dealing with these environmental challenges.
Yeah, I would just quickly say that I think there's a wrong assumption here that somehow prior to US punitive sanctions on Iran, that Iran did have a serious environmental policy to deal with some of these issues related to climate change. And now as a result of American sanctions, those policies have been somehow substantively upended and changed. I don't think that's the case. Clearly, Iran under sanctions can't do anything can't import anything of a serious nature that can, improve the overall economy of the country. But even if it could, even if tomorrow, let's say, I could wave a magic wand and sanctions would be lifted, I don't see anyone in Tehran prioritizing the question of the environment or climate change. In fact, everything that we know is that, as Trita rightfully pointed out, those environmental activists in civil society that seemed and thought they were safe and who were doing good work on questions of climate change, they've all been rounded up and put in prison, and some of them have been killed. So I think on these questions, one can't ignore the structure of power in Iran, the very misguided policies of the regime, which have to be laid at the doorstep of those decision makers in Tehran. You can't blame this particular problem on Washington, D.C. You can blame a lot of other problems, but not this one.
Can I chime in as well?
Yeah, of course.
Just very quickly. I think Nader is absolutely right on this. The Iranian state's own failure, and as I mentioned earlier on, a lot of things that it's done that actually made matters worse. It's not just neglect, it's actually made matters worse, is the primary problem here. At the same time, I think we do have to remember one thing. I have not seen any particular concrete evidence in which I can say, well, look, these specific technologies were about to be imported, but because of the sanctions, they couldn't. But we should also recognize that when you have this degree of an embargo in which nothing really can be sold to the country, the sanctions are on the financial sector, which means that it sanctions the transactions, then everything in the country is affected by this. And when you reduce the GDP, with 25%, as the sanctions have done, then a lot of different priorities that could have been there are not being there. And as Nader said, these were not necessarily priorities prior to that. But there's a lot of other priorities that have been slashed and sacrificed as a result of this. I think that context is still very important to keep in mind. And it shows how devastating sanctions tend to be when it comes to destroying the very fabric of society, particularly if they continue over a prolonged period of time.
I think the question of sanctions is actually perhaps a good one for us to end on. We have just a few more minutes, and I'm going to ask each of the three of you for some closing words. But I think that the question of US sanctions is the fundamental component of what is at the root of the challenge that we face in this country, that we need to take responsibility for changing in terms of what the relationship between the United States and Iran is, and what the crisis between the two countries is, what the danger is of a regional, potentially even global war that could emerge out of these tensions. So the question of sanctions is very much at the heart of that. So let me ask each of you, maybe we'll come back to you, David, to start with a few closing words for people in remembering that we're in this country, and the question of what's our obligations, our capacity here, what should we be thinking about, watching for, and doing?
I think the situation we're facing vis-a-vis Iran is a direct result of a non-democratic foreign policy, a foreign policy that's driven by imperial interests, that has the trajectory of which has not changed significantly over many, many decades. So while I share some of the optimism that a regime change in Washington might bring a fundamental move away from the policy of confrontation with Iran, I'm not totally convinced that that's going to happen. Yes, we should be working toward that end. One of the things that we quote in the book is a comment that Joanne Lai made apocryphally years ago. One of the delightful things about Americans is that they have absolutely no historical memory. And I think, this book goes a lot to restoring that historical memory. We have, as Studs Terkel used to say, a national Alzheimer's disease in this country. No one remembers any history whatsoever. And so this book seeks to address some of those issues and open up bridges toward new ways of thinking rather than the same old confrontational, demonizing Iran. And, and they're an easy target. It's a theocratic regime with numerous human rights violations, as has been described by both Trita and Nader as well. So it's time for movement here in the US to put pressure on whichever government is going to be in Washington to think about thinking outside the box and creatively coming up with new ways, avenues to build bridges rather than walls between our two countries.
Thanks, David. Nader.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on that. I think, while we have, a deeply problematic U.S. foreign policy toward Iran currently, a deeply immoral one, and under Joe Biden, arguably it might be better. I think the bigger question here, the bigger long-term focus is really the crisis of democracy in this country. I mean, we are literally less than a month away from what seems like it's going to be a political coup, if not a fascist takeover. Donald Trump is openly, stating that that's the plan. And I don't think we can really think constructively over the long term about a better U.S. foreign policy toward Iran or toward any other country in the world, unless we fix our own internal democracy or what's left of it in this country. I think that's where the biggest focus needs to be for those of us who are, seriously interested in creating a better world. I mean, one of the tragic sort of elements of the current moment that we're passing through, among all of the, problems that we're facing, is, I had a lot of hope and a lot of optimism that perhaps we might have a Bernie Sanders candidacy or possible presidency, where there would be some cause for optimism. That ship has now sailed, but I think we need to really build on the momentum and the successes that were registered around that particular political campaign. I think the grievances, the agenda, the problems that motivated people to support Bernie Sanders, both domestically and foreign policy. I think those problems are not going away, and I think we really need to build a vibrant movement to fix our own democracy here in the United States, with the hope that once we do, and if we can do it, and if there is a possibility of changing the direction of this country, then possibly we might be able to have a serious conversation of what a just U.S. foreign policy toward Iran might look like. That's where I think the priority should be. And that's where I'd like to see people focus their attention on.
Thanks, Nader. Trita.
I like to associate myself with those two comments, and I'll just add a smaller point. I don't think that there will be a fix to the relationship between the United States and Iran unless there is first a reassessment and a redesign of America's own foreign policy in the Middle East as a whole. If the United States continues to seek hegemony in the region, if it continues to believe that its military posture there is necessary in order to protect the US itself, I suspect that the tensions between the two countries will remain. There may be moments in which it will reduce a little bit, but that is going to be a fundamental problem. Moreover, it's really difficult to see the Iranians and the United States being able to collaborate on a whole set of different issues or come to terms, forget about collaborating, come to some form of a compromise if the United States continues to have that ambition, because that ambition keeps the US in the region, it keeps the US supporting the Saudis, etc. So I think if, particularly in a democratic rebirth of the country, a much more profound review of the US's own interest in the region is needed, because in my assessment, the region is not at all that important to the United States to warrant this degree of involvement and this degree of military presence in the region. And if we take that away, I'm not saying the region is going to be in a fantastic shape, but I do believe that some of the obstacles that have prevented countries from seeking diplomacy, seeking regional solutions, will be removed. It will still be a tricky scenario, but right now, if you were in Saudi Arabia, why would you pursue a security arrangement with Tehran and try to reduce those tensions when it is so much easier for you to just spend some lobbying dollars in Washington in order to be able to use America's power in order to settle your own rivalry with Iran? As long as that option remains available, you're not going to see the desire or the incentive for some of these countries to actually pursue genuine regional diplomacy.
Thanks for that, Trita. Thank you all. I think that the challenge to all of us is this question of what can we do to carry out the challenge to those so-called strategic interests, so-called military necessities, so-called militarization over diplomacy that we have seen characterizing US foreign policy for so long. The goal of diplomacy instead of war remains, I think, our main goal. And this important new book, ReTargeting Iran, can be a major resource in helping us figure out ways of doing it. Thank you all for participating with us. Thank you all for those of you who came to join us, to listen, to learn, to talk, to discuss, and we will continue. Thank you all. Looking forward to seeing you again very soon. Good night.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.